Le coup de projecteur de l'éclaireur, Pascal Lottaz avec vous. Je reçois aujourd'hui Pascal Lottaz pour parler de neutralité, de guerre en Ukraine et des tensions en Asie. Pascal Lottaz est professeur de relations internationales à l'université de Kyoto au Japon. Il est également l'animateur de Neutrality Studies, un groupe d'études universitaires sur la neutralité et le non-alignement dans les relations internationales. Pascal Lottaz, thank you very much for taking time to speaking with us. Could you please start by presenting yourself as well as Neutrality Studies?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. So my name is Pascal Lottaz. I'm an associate professor at Kyoto University in Japan. I am a Swiss national. I'm from the canton of Fribourg, but I'm from the German-speaking part. I grew up in Fribourg, and I went to to a high school and university there, and then I came to Japan for my master's degree and my PhD. My PhD I started in 2014 at the so-called National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. I finished that in 2018, and ever since then I've been teaching and researching international relations, especially my core topic of neutrality in international relations. On the one hand, I'm Swiss, and the Swiss love their neutrality. On the other hand, I do think that the topic is not researched enough, especially in a global context. So I'm trying to do that from here.
Okay. Could you remind us the history of neutrality? Where does it stem from? And what has been its function in the modern international system?
That's a very nice question. The history of neutrality is at least 2,500 years old, because we find it.
So it's not Westphalia Treaty that most people believe.
Excuse me?
It's not Westphalian, as most people believe.
No, it's definitely older. The thing is that neutrality is always a reaction to conflict. Whenever two parties go to war or have a conflict with each other, you will usually find other parties that try to evade that. And we find it, in the Melian dialogue, this famous piece of writing about Thucydides in ancient Greece, who wrote about the Melians. The sentence, "The weak suffer what they must." That sentence is in the Melian dialogue, and it's about the Athenians who go to Melos and then tell the Melians, either you become our ally and go to war with us, or we kill you all. And the Melians, they make a point of saying that, no, we have the right to be neutral. We don't want to choose between you and the Spartans, so we will remain neutral, and we have a right to be neutral. And then sure enough, they don't have enough army and they get destroyed and killed, which is usually then an argument against, being idealist. But it is really interesting to see that the Melians defended their right to not have to go to war with one or the other side against the other one. And then there's other examples, in India, ancient India, there's a wonderful text by Kautilya, the Arthashastra, in which Kautilya writes about when is it smart for a prince, for a king, to be neutral, different moments when it makes sense not to pick sides. So the concept of neutrality is ancient, and modern day neutrality, the way we know it, especially in Europe, that is a European invention that goes back about 700-800 years and is codified in international law, especially for permanent neutrals. But that is then a bit more technical in the legal sense, and we can talk about that as well if you want.
What's the function of neutrality in conflict?
Well, the main purpose of neutrality is always to keep the neutral out of war, to make sure that the security of a neutral state or a neutral actor is provided, even when others are going to war with each other, right? And then a second function closely connected to that is to allow for trade. For the neutral, but also for the belligerents. Usually when states are actors go to war with each other, they, of course, immediately stop trading with each other. But usually they still want to get access to some of the resources that they don't have themselves. And then they do that through neutrals, and neutrals try to maintain as normal a relationship with belligerents as they can, because they're not at war with either of them, and hence have an interest in continuing prosperous relationships with both belligerents, which then both belligerents usually say, like, hey, it's okay if you trade with me. Of course, I want to trade with you, but don't trade with the other guy, because the other guy is evil, because we are fighting a war with them. Therefore, you should stop trading with them. And then the neutrals come under pressure from both sides, usually.
Mm-hmm. And in peacetime, does neutrality has a role too? Because it does, both office, as we usually say, which is not something that needs to be discarded. I mean, it's quite important, isn't it?
No, I do believe it is important. You know, neutrals serve several functions even during peace times. On the one hand, they permanent neutral states like Switzerland, Austria, but also Mongolia and others who try to play and use the neutrality concept. Although the Mongolians, they are not officially neutral, but they've been working with the concept for a while. These states are also buffer states in international relations, right? They promise to everybody around them that they will not join any military alliance. So, I mean, take the Mongolians. If Mongolia was in a hard military alliance with Russia, that would be a threat to China. If they were in a hard military alliance with China, that would be and was a threat to the other one before. So buffer zones of little pieces of land that actually might have a military and usually do have militaries and do defend themselves, but that cannot become part of a hostile alliance, that itself also can help to stabilize an international system. Now, it can also fail, I must say that. The German invasion of neutral Belgium in the First World War was such a case when neutrality failed to provide a functioning buffer state and to keep war small.
What do you make of Sweden and Finland accession into NATO?
I regret that they took that decision. I understand that it happened because at least a good part of the population seems to feel very threatened by Russia, because Russia obviously invaded Ukraine and set a very bad precedent for that one. On the other hand, the Ukraine conflict itself is extremely complex, and the reaction, the history that is behind the invasion of 2022 is a very long one. And neither Finland nor Sweden had any kind of like problems with Russia the way that Ukraine had problems with Russia. And during the Cold War, for Finland and before 200 years for Sweden, these two states have maintained a very reasonable and very good relationship actually toward Russia and the Soviet Union. And I think it is rather a loss for Europe that these two neutrals are gone and that they're now part of a military alliance which very much says that Russia is the greatest threat to Europe. So the Russians naturally will perceive that as a military threat, which it is. And so if Finland and Sweden start stationing large contingents of NATO personnel and NATO weapons, then that will only escalate the situation with Russia. And in the worst case, if there should be a NATO-Russia war, Finland and Sweden will be front states and will be attacked, because they have to be attacked by Russia if there is. And
it will be destroyed, basically. It will be vitrified, and no one in Europe is going to move.
Finland and Sweden were safe as neutrals because not a threat to Russia or the Soviet Union, and now they are going to be a threat to Russia. So if a war happens, they will be attacked. And I do think that is a very unfortunate development.
I mean, and on top of that, their neutrality was a very important pillar of their prosperity, especially for Finland. We saw what happened to Finland after the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, the economic situation, I remember that, was very dire. How do you see things going with the war in Ukraine? We do have a lot of escalatory speech, but obviously those making them, first one of them being Macron, do not seem to have enough muscles on their bones to perform that. How do you see that situation evolving from the Asian vantage point?
It is very dangerous. I mean, I follow these events, of course, extremely closely because our European home is here is in danger, and our European home, I include the Russians. They are part of that, and the big problem we have in Europe is that for the last 2,000 years, we don't manage to have a single century without war. We usually don't manage to have a single decade without war. And this is just a continuation of something we Europeans, including the Russians, we've just been doing forever. So the escalatory speech is very, very dangerous because at the moment, the Ukraine war is at I would say it's at a crossroads. It is very clear, even to the most ardent ideologues in the West, that Ukraine is not winning this war, despite all the rhetoric, despite all the weapon deliveries, despite all the miracle weapons that were talked about and promised and so on. Ukraine is losing. The Wunderwaffen, they're not working, and the Ukraine is losing this war. So there's only two things that can be done now. Either an acceptance that this is what it is and that negotiations with Russia need to start, and they need to start as soon as possible, or boots on the ground, so NATO troops in Ukraine, because Ukraine's biggest problem is that they don't have enough men and women to fight the war. They're running out of people. That's the one thing you cannot replenish, besides the fact that that NATO countries also can't deliver enough artillery shells and so on. But as you're correctly saying, France and European NATO members, they don't have what it takes. So everybody is looking at the United States. If the Europeans can convince the Americans to actually send troops, they will go, and that would be a disaster.
Well, that's even the US don't have what it takes to have a direct war. I mean, today to have a direct war with Russia. Now let's shift to Asia and what's happening in the China Sea. How do you see things evolving, and what's Japan's position on that?
Well, Japan's worst case scenario is a war with China, or the level before that is a US-China war, potentially over Taiwan. The island of Taiwan is very, very close to some of Japan's islands in Okinawa, really close. Like we're talking about less than 200 kilometers. And for Japan, this is a worst case scenario. So they try to avoid that by all means possible. But at the same time, the Japanese are still very closely integrated into the US security system. What NATO is for Europe is the so-called US-Japan alliance for Japan. It is the backbone of the entire Japanese security thought of how to defend Japan, that in case of emergency, the United States will be there and will help Japan. And in return, Japan has to help the United States as far as possible. For instance, there's a lot of US bases in Japan, right? And these US bases, they are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they do project US power over the Japanese islands. On the other hand, if there ever was a US-China war, the US would use these bases probably for its military effort, in which case China would probably have to attack these bases. And since they are on Japanese soil, that would immediately drag Japan into the war. So it is a dangerous situation.
Japanese population is not so fond of these bases.
No, especially in the places where these bases are located.
Okinawa, and huge issues.
In Okinawa and so on, people are not fans of these bases, but people in the main island who are far away from the bases, they care much less. And security thinkers here in Japan, they all agree that the bases are very much necessary. There is a lot of neocon hawks also here in Japan who wouldn't want to get rid of them, of the bases, and of course maintain this potential. But I must say that Japan last year changed its security approach and core security documents to now also producing more offensive weapons, and that would allow Japan to defend itself even if the United States withdrew a lot of its materials. So Japan is sensitive to what's happening and is preparing for also the contingency of the US saying goodbye and leaving. But this is of course something that then would create more militarism inside Japan, which is also not a happy thought, because Japan, we must admit, did horrible things to China, and the Chinese remember that. And the Chinese, they still do fear the Japanese militarism. So we must be very careful not to kick off an escalatory spiral between Japan and China either. Although at the moment they are talking to each other. They installed a direct phone line last year between the minister of...
They have good relationships. I mean, they've been having good relationship for quite a while now, China and Russia, haven't they?
Sorry, China and Russia, yes. What I mean is China and Japan.
Oh, China and Japan, excuse me. No, I meant China and Japan. So China and Japan have been having pretty good relationship for quite a while.
No, well, not excellent, but not too bad. I mean, they do meet, but they do have disputes over islands, for instance. They do have, Japan does follow the US refrain about China being a potential threat. And I mean, China is viewed in security terms as a potential threat for Japan. The Japanese are less worried about the Russians. The Japanese are worried about the Chinese. But economically, they do cooperate to a good degree, although the Japanese also enact like U.S. restrictions, for instance, on what kind of chips can be sold to China. So Japan is in the boat of the United States, but it is trying to have a better relationship with China than the United States has.
Okay, what about the rest of Asia? I'm thinking about Korea, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and the likes.
You mean the relationship with China or their relationship with Japan?
Relationship with China and the perception of a potential US-China conflict in the region.
Well, to all of them, this is a big threat, and they do think about it a lot at the moment and also talk about it openly. I was at a meeting, an ASEAN workshop recently in Jakarta, you know, where the ASEAN is the 10 states, a group of Southeast Asian nations, and they think about what do we do in case of a US-China war, and they think about the vulnerability of their countries. The Philippines, for instance, is very, very, very vulnerable and is being threatened by China. That is the case. China says a lot of these islands or features in front of the Philippines actually belong to China, and they do dispatch their coast guard and they chase Filipino fishermen away. So this is a very bad development for them. And in response, the Philippines now has opened new military bases, U.S. military bases, trying to be stronger with the U.S. as an ally. But this can also backfire again, right, and just create more tension in the region. The one that's most under threat is, of course, Taiwan, because there's an open dispute about what Taiwan exactly is. Maybe we can talk about that, but it's also a very complex issue.
There's been the one-China policy since the beginning of the 70s, so it does seems to be a tad more complicated than what I am stating.
It's a little bit more complex because the most important thing to understand is that we in the West, we are constantly fed the idea that there is a country called Taiwan, and then that there's a country called China, and that these two countries are separate. The problem is more complex because even the Taiwanese call their government, the government ruling Taiwan from Taipei, the main city, this government is called the Republic of China. The government ruling from Beijing, the mainland of China, that government is called the People's Republic of China. There is no Republic of Taiwan. So, and that all goes back to 1949 when, you know, the civil war in China ended and Chiang Kai-shek retreated his troops to Taiwan and took the Republic of China with him. And he said, from then on, from 49, the capital city of the Republic of China is now in Taipei, and we are just regrouping, and then we're going to reconquer the whole of China. But that never happened, right? And then you have two Chinese entities, two Chinese states that both say, "I am China." that was 49, and then a lot of things happen and history happens, and by now the Taiwanese don't want to have control over China. They don't want to reconquer the Chinese mainland. What they want, the people living in Taiwan, is they would like to have their own country. But by now the mainland Chinese are saying, as they have been saying over the last 70 years, no guys, you're also Chinese, we belong together and you're part of us. And that's the controversy. The problem that we have in the West is that for several reasons, we are made believe that these are two separate countries, when in fact exactly that is being disputed, and we don't have a solution for it, which makes it so dangerous. But this conflict is 70 years old.
Yeah, but will China basically let Taiwan become independent?
No.
Keeping in mind that Taiwan has always been used as a natural aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
For the invasion of China. And I'm not talking about the Japanese, but I'm also thinking about the Opium Wars.
Yeah.
We French, Americans, Germans, went into China this way.
Yeah. No, China will go to war over Taiwan the way that Russia is willing to go to war over Ukraine. These two cases are very similar in this sense, that those are core interests. So for anyone who's interested in a peaceful settlement of this conflict, the question is how to maintain the current status quo until a peaceful solution emerges over time. If there's these two visions, right? The Chinese main vision in Beijing is that Taipei stops saying that it is Taiwan and accepts that it is just a province of China and officially becomes part of China, and Chinese military can go there and so on and so forth. And the vision of the people of some people in Taipei is that China accepts that Taiwan is independent the way that Mongolia is independent, right? And that it becomes officially its own proper country and becomes the Republic of Taiwan. Both of these scenarios will only be achieved, I think, through war, at least at the moment. So in order not to have a war, we need some other vision of how China and Taiwan can cooperate, maintaining their position, but not getting everything they want. So it's some people imagine, for instance, a Chinese federation, that both parts, Taipei and Beijing, accept that they're Chinese, but they're more like a federal state or a union state, a little bit the way that Belarus and Russia exist together.
Mm-hmm. But the U.S. attitude in the area is problematic too, especially when it comes to freedom of trade.
No, it didn't. China's saber rattling when it comes to Taiwan or so, is usually done through the air, like through airplanes, military airplanes flying over Taiwanese airspace or Taiwanese claimed airspace. They don't try to block trade. China doesn't want to block trade. Also, the trade with Taiwan is still, at the moment, this is open and it's continuing, right? China is actually the largest trading partner of Taiwan. So it's a very important market for Taiwan as well, which just shows how pragmatic these people are, and that even though on paper we have a conflict, in reality we also have a lot of very well working cooperation. And the United States, to me, is an insecurity factor. I am most afraid of what the United States might be doing, because some of these actions, like last year when Nancy Pelosi visited Taipei, those are very, very rude and radical things to do that some people in Taipei want, but others don't. And it just creates a lot of tension, and I'm not a fan of that.
Mm-hmm. Now, to switch back to Europe, do you think that NATO still has a future?
Yes, I think NATO has a future, just for the simple fact that it has been around for a long time. Although, as a historian, the only thing I can say for sure is that nothing lasts forever. NATO will end at some point, but the question is when. At the moment, it looks to me that NATO is rather strong. But the thing is with NATO, NATO is the United States. If Germany or France or Spain or Estonia withdrew from NATO, the others wouldn't care very much. If the US ever withdraws, then NATO is dead. So the question is, how long does the United States want to maintain NATO? If Donald Trump becomes the next president, I think he would continue NATO. I don't think he would exit, because he didn't exit last time. So I don't have any reason to believe he would exit next time. But if still he decided to do so, or if something happened in the US that would lead them to say, like, okay, we're done with NATO, we have a completely new strategy, we're going to call all of our troops back, and we're going to concentrate on our two continents, well, then NATO would be dead, and then a new security alliance in Europe would probably emerge, probably centered around the EU.
Now, focusing on Switzerland, your home country, what's your assessment of what's going on around there? Because we've seen some moves toward less neutrality.
Well, on the one hand, what we are seeing currently is the natural progression of how Switzerland changed its foreign policy after the end of the Cold War. During the Cold War, Switzerland it was pretty clear that the Swiss would maintain more or less militarily and economically a distance from any kind of international clubs. I mean, the Swiss didn't even join the United Nations until 2002, because they said that wouldn't square with our neutrality. And then even during the Cold War, Switzerland was integrated into the economic structure of the West, right? And it was always clear that military service in Switzerland has to be done, because we need to practice what happens when the Russians attack. That was always clear, but politically Switzerland kept more of an equidistant foreign policy. Then the end of the Cold War came, and even Russia joined the Partnership for Peace that NATO started. So Switzerland also started cooperating with NATO, and from there it has been 30 years in which cooperation for Switzerland was cooperation with the EU and cooperation with NATO, and this trend is progressing now.
Switzerland has been cooperating currently with NATO for ages. I'm thinking about the P26 organization.
So there was cooperation forever, but the cooperation became much closer after the Cold War, and it became more outspoken. And Switzerland also sent some military personnel to the Kosovo, to the KFOR. Which was a huge debate, by the way. But, step by step, Switzerland has been in the same track as Finland and Sweden. But because Switzerland has its neutrality enshrined in its constitution, it hasn't gotten rid of its neutrality yet. But there is people who would like to see that happen. There's people in Switzerland who would rather have Switzerland to be another member of NATO than to remain neutral. I don't belong to those people, and I actively work against that. I support the neutrality referendum that we are working on at the moment, in order to write into our constitution what our definition of neutrality is, and that economic neutrality is one part of that we shouldn't partake in sanctions unless threatened. And if we do that, if that happens in 2-3 years down the road, then we might swing back to a more integral version of neutrality, and not this current form where Switzerland says we are neutral when it comes to the war, to military affairs, but we are not neutral in economic and ideological terms and so on. We will join the good side against the evil side, and we will put sanctions on other countries. But I don't think that's a good idea.
The good side is being determined by the US now.
Yeah, it's
a very nasty question. Aren't Swiss banks in that respect a significant threat to Swiss sovereignty, because whether we like it or not, that's the Federal Reserve that actually refinances them, especially for their off-balance accounts. We saw what happened with Credit Suisse and stuff like that.
I mean, as any large industry in any country, it's a great opportunity, and it's a great threat. If the industry collapses, then it takes down basically the whole country. And Switzerland is vulnerable through its banks. This was very, very clear back in 2009 when we had a dispute. Switzerland had a dispute with the United States about the Bank Secrecy Act. The US said, we want to get the details of all the accounts that Americans and residents in the US have in Swiss banks. And Switzerland said, sorry, we can't deliver that because Bank Secrecy Act. The Swiss bank said they couldn't deliver, and then the US started threatening, look, if either you give us this data, or we're gonna kick Switzerland off the US money market, which means you cannot lend US dollars, borrow dollars anymore in our market, which would be the death of UBS. And the death of the UBS is basically the death of Switzerland. So the Swiss government actually enacted emergency law in order to allow the banks to hand over that data. And that's the moment when the Swiss Bank Secrecy Act basically died. And this is a good example for how a country can be vulnerable through one of its largest industries. At the moment, UBS sucked up Credit Suisse, and which is a bad development, because by now UBS is even more too big to fail. So if something happens to UBS, the Swiss government will have to back them up. So the UBS basically has unlimited credit from the Swiss government, which these bankers will certainly use in not very wise ways, as they never do. That's why you need regulation. You need to regulate these banks in order to make sure the country doesn't collapse.
Yeah, and to bring them down, because are you talking about going back to the good old separation between merchant banking on one hand and investment banking on the other hand?
Very important. Very, very important. This Basel III, actually, which came after the Lehman shocks, is quite important for that one. But this must never, ever, ever be weakened. The investment banks can only play with money that for which they actually have their own savings. They can never ever use retail money from you and I, but they always find ways to do that. That's why it's really important to regulate.
So shadow banking now you're talking about, because that's the way they're doing it, through shadow banking.
Yeah, I believe that, and this is a huge threat, because these people are highly greedy. And the good trick is always that you privatize gains and you socialize losses. So whenever bankers find a way to make sure that the money they gamble with is not the one that they would pay if they lose it, they will do it. And I don't know enough about how the system works at the moment. I just do hope that the FINMA and all of our regulators are at least on par with the banks, and not 2 or 3 steps behind.
Pascal Lottaz, thank you so much for your time.